Science and technology.
So think big, big picture science, Saturdays at 8 a.m.
on KSJE, the information and cultural beacon of the Four Corners.
Hi, I'm Sam Payne, host of The Appleseed, an hour filled with stories for you and your family. And we're not talking about news stories here. We're talking about fairy tales and folk tales and personal stories and family tales and even a little music from time to time. And each story could spark a memory for you that you can share with the people that you love. Hear The Appleseed every Thursday at noon, right here on the information and cultural beacon of the Four Corners, KSJE, Farmington, New Mexico.
A new topic, local favorites, will be featured every other Wednesday on Roving with the Arts with me, your host, Mick Hess. I'll be talking with local classical, jazz, and folk musicians about their favorite styles of music and hear musical excerpts that are some of their favorites. You'll even find out what kind of music they would want to hear if they were stranded on a Pacific island. Join me for some interesting and entertaining musical insights of some of your favorite local musicians.
KSJE is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center, here to meet your urgent and emergent medical needs, whether they are COVID-19 related or not. Medical emergencies happen when you least expect them, whether it's a stroke, heart attack, illness, or injury. San Juan Regional Medical Center's caregivers are here to provide care to you and your loved ones. Find out more online at sanjuanregional.com. "11 minutes past 8 o'clock. It is Thursday morning, November 5th. Good morning, everybody. I'm Scott Michlin. Thanks for tuning in to KSJE 90.9 FM over the air, of course, here in San Juan County, New Mexico, 103.3 FM over the air in Durango, Colorado, and streaming everywhere from our website at ksje.com. Welcome also to our viewers who are watching this visual radio program. It is streaming live this morning to the KSJE YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and we even got it streaming to our Twitter account today. So welcome aboard, everyone. We are glad that you are with us because coming up in the next few moments, my guest, archaeologist Paul Reed, is here, and I've asked him to talk with me today about leadership in the ancient world, and he's done a lot of research on that, and that should be a interesting discussion, which will start in the next few moments right here on KSJE. So stay tuned for that, everybody. It's coming up next. Then, of course, we will go to our COVID-19 community information program at the top of the hour at 9 a.m. Megan Cullop will be joining me here in Studio A, and we'll be talking about a number of developments since we last spoke about this issue on Monday. We'll get an update from our hospital from Dr. Bob Underwood, the Chief of Staff at San Juan Regional Medical Center. Also from Basin Health Companies, Vince Moffett and Dion Brown will be joining us about some of the changes that they are doing in their workplace as their employees go out and about in the community. We do have increasing cases here in San Juan County as well as the rest of our state. So we'll get an update coming up today. Live at 9 a.m., of course, streaming on YouTube and Facebook. And, of course, a rebroadcast always every day, same day of the show, at 5:06 p.m. on KSJE Radio, and of course, streaming on our website. On the radio side of things at 9 this morning, Mick Hess is going to be playing from Roving with the Arts, of course, and his selection today is The Planets from Holst. You'll hear that today at 9:06 on Roving with the Arts. That's coming up on KSJE. Don't forget, of course, you can also connect with us on Instagram in addition to Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And let's talk about the weather forecast, shall we? For the next couple of days, it's going to be mostly sunny today with a high of 73 in Farmington, clear and 40 overnight. Partly cloudy skies tomorrow with a high of 72 on Friday, overnight low near 50. Then maybe a chance of showers on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. Take a look, and cooling weather as well. 63 only for a high on Saturday, 51 for a high on Sunday with a chance of rain and snow mix perhaps. And on Monday, we're only seeing a high of 43 with overnight lows from the upper 30s on Saturday night down into the mid-20s by Monday night. And, of course, we always tell you that visual radio can take you places. We will take you right now to the sunny Mad River Valley in Vermont, Currently sunny and 54 degrees in Mad River Valley of Vermont. Beautiful covered bridge there that you can see on the screen, and the river running through it, sunshine reflecting off the river. And it's going to be a high of 57 today with an overnight low of 45 degrees. So we're enjoying that as well. That brings me to my guest, who is waiting patiently and joining us live remotely from his home near Taos, New Mexico. Archaeologist Paul Reed is on the program today. Paul, good morning. It's good to see you.
Good morning, Scott. Glad to see you and glad to be back.
Good to have you back, of course, and we can hear you and we can see you, so I'm all excited that the technology is working today. So
That's right.
Go us. Very good. Well, as I mentioned, I kind of thought it'd be interesting to talk since we just got through an election in this country, of course, and watch the votes being counted as they continue to be across the country. That what do we know about leadership in the ancient world? At Chaco Canyon, of course, and some of the other ancestral Puebloan towns and villages that we talk about on this program with you on a regular basis. I know that you've done some work on this, and there are some other theories on how leaders were chosen or just selected. So I thought that'd be kind of cool for a topic of a show today. And so what can you tell us of what we know? At least let's start with Chaco Canyon, because I know you've done a lot of work there.
Right. Sure. Well, the short answer is Chaco had leadership.
Right.
And that's, I'm not sure that's breathtaking news.
All right. Well, we'll see you next month. Thank you, Paul.
That's right. I love it when we check these boxes fast. And
That's right.
Well, no, I mean, it's, I do tours, of course, in Chaco, and I've done a lot of writing for the public on Chaco, and it's a common question that comes up. And I think, one of the contrasts that I like to draw for people is that, in the modern world, of course, we live in, from a political standpoint, and the way political anthropologists would classify things, a complicated state level society. So, there's different schema that people have proposed and worked through, but I'm dating myself here. The one I grew up with, in the sense of my anthropological and archaeological training, is a fairly simple, straightforward topology that talks about groups moving from a band level society to a tribal level, to a chiefdom level, to a state level. And any of my colleagues who might catch this are probably, especially the younger ones, just hitting their heads against the wall, because we have gotten more sophisticated through time in how we look at these models. But the reason I like that relatively straightforward, band to chief to tribe to band to tribe to chiefdom to state is it helps us kind of have an initial starting point to talk about it. So modern industrial society is very complicated. Our country has 330 million people. We have multiple levels of jurisdiction in our state, in our state level society, and as well as our state of New Mexico. So if we go to the past, we do find that in general, political organization is not as complicated. There's certainly exceptions, but people track sort of the evolution of political complexity to, the Agrarian Revolution, depending upon where we're at in the world, 10,000 to 7 or 8,000 years ago. That's when we really start to see the emergence of full-time leaders. Before that, for much of our time on the planet as humans, people moved in relatively small groups, that we might call bands or extended family groups. And leadership mostly in those cases tied to different individuals who had proven themselves over time to have the qualities that, those little small bands wanted in leadership.
Right.
So, this is sort of the classic good old days, I guess, if you want to look at it compared to our behemoth and, intricately complicated system now. And those leaders, were not necessarily men. They probably did tend to be older members of society. We know that, many groups value the contributions of women and the accumulated knowledge through those lines, those matriarchal lines. So that's the model that we have for a big portion of our time on the planet when people were mostly moving to the resources, right? They were hunting, they were going to places where natural plants would come out, certain times a year. Once people settle down and we have sedentism, then, the leadership thing really gets more complicated, and so does most of the things that tie to these different societies. So Chaco, of course, is the center of a Pueblo cultural society that developed over thousands of years down there. And by the time Chaco becomes what we recognize as Chaco, say in the 900s to 1000 and after, they're building these amazing buildings. People are growing lots of corn. There's all this activity going on. Chaco had, in my view, a very well organized leadership system. But when we excavate sites as archaeologists or read through records as historians, different kinds of researchers, we can't, in archaeology anyway, excavate leadership, right? This is an abstract concept. So we have to take the things that we find in archaeological contexts and sites, artifacts, the way things are distributed, and say, well, we think this informs what we want to understand about, say, leadership. So that's a long preamble.
Right.
But,
That's okay, because I asked you.
That's the background, I think, to at least one approach to trying to understand leadership in Chaco. So,
but I guess in a broader sense, Paul Reed, couldn't we say? I mean, it's just, I guess, human nature that we have leaders in our groups, whatever that may be. I mean, you mentioned even hunter gatherers. If I had a good kill, I may be now the leader of the group because I had a good kill and provided food for my group for a few days or what have you, right?
Right, and that's a great point because in the past and even today, a lot of leadership that we see at different levels is based on a person's individual qualities that are perceived by the group to be leadership qualities. Like you said, maybe a good hunter, maybe someone who
a chicken in every pot.
Yeah, exactly. Someone who understands the land
right
in the best way. Because if you're a hunter-gatherer, in a group, a band like that, you're having to move around and you got to know where those resources are at what time of year. And of course, the climate is an influence on that, but you need that accumulated leadership. So again, I think the leadership tends to favor, the older folks just because they've had more time.
Right. And I suppose, I keep interrupting and I apologize, Paul Reed, but I wanted to ask too, and I guess if you can't then provide, maybe if there's a food shortage or a food spoilage, and I keep going back to food, maybe because I had a small breakfast today or something, but if you can't provide for your followers, for your group, then I guess that would maybe even put pressure on a change in leadership as well, right? We see some of that over time.
Right, and what we see with band level groups, and even for some that are a little more complicated than that, is that people vote with their feet too. Let's say you've got a group that's come together with 5 or 6 related pretty large families. Maybe you have 50 people encamped in an area for a time. If part of the group is not happy with the leadership or where the group is talking about going next, then they'll vote with their feet and they'll go off on their own. So that was one of the main options to avoid, I think, conflict in the past, before population got to a certain point. I mean, once you have people in a lot of different areas on the planet or on a continent or whatever piece of territory, then voting with your feet is not really much of an option unless there are areas you can go to and find those resources. So anyway, that's one thing we look at. The other thing I was going to mention, as I'm talking about the leadership, in some of these more traditional older societies, mostly skewing to the older folks with the experience. The contrast for that, of course, is what we see in ancient Egypt. And this is not my area of expertise, as you know, but you think about, the important tombs and, the long dynasties that developed there. And we have, of course, King Tutankhamun, King Tut, buried in one of the most richly appointed burial sites planets that as developed there, and we have, of course, Tutankhamun, clearly, and once one of the most leadership develops and becomes hereditary, then it changes the ballgame. As developed there, we have, of course, leadership automatically going to someone who clearly have the most knowledge. So I'm not suggesting that Chaco had hereditary leadership. We don't. I don't personally believe leadership automatically. The contrast, of course, is so I'm not suggesting that Steve has written extensively.
Let me stop you there for a minute, Paul. We're getting a little bit of audio feedback, and I don't know why that's happening. So hold on one second while I try to just check a couple of things here, and we'll bring you back in just a second. I apologize, viewers and listeners, for that. For a minute, Paul. We're now I'm getting myself coming back, but I think maybe I fixed it. Let's try that again, Paul. All right, we'll try it again with Paul Reed. I apologize, and let's see. Can you still hear me all right, Paul?
Yeah, it sounds good on my end.
Okay, you were getting a little audio loop coming back through, which was very strange, but I think we're good for the moment. So, new technology, we love it. But please continue. I'm sorry we interrupted you again.
Well, it's that's fine. We're keeping it real. So whatever's happening is what's happening right now. So anyway, Steve Lexon, who we've talked about on the show, and Steve has made great contributions in the field. Steve believes that the leadership was more formalized in Chaco, and he goes so far as to use the notion of nobles and commoners, and borrowing sort of a European or otherworldly model. And some of us aren't as comfortable with that. I mean, I'm pretty clear in my own mind that Chaco had distinct leaders, and that those leaders were able to do more than simply persuade or encourage the people they were leading, to engage in a behavior. One of the real simple models we use is, in the Amish world and other agrarian societies in our own country's past, people would do barn raisings, right?
Sure.
So you would know that you were putting up a barn that day, and you'd prep your materials and build what you could, but then you would invite families from the surrounding area so that you could end up with 50 to 100 plus people. And, in particular, a lot of strong young people to help you pull up the walls of the barn. So that's a kind of leadership that we describe as situational. So in other words, when you need the barn raised, it's your place. And so whoever's the leader in that, small family outfit says, hey, I need help. So people come in, they cooperate, they get the barn raised. And, after a couple of days, whatever amount of time, people go back and they do their own things. And maybe the next time it's the Jones family that need a barn raising. But you don't have a permanent political structure in place that, is the barn raising committee. I mean,
right.
Well, maybe there is a committee, but,
yes.
The point is it comes and goes, and then people are back to mostly just getting along as relative equals.
Sure.
I don't equate Chaco to any kind of barn raising move because there's too much going on in Chaco for especially those decades in the 900s and the early 1000s and up to 1100. There's just a whole lot of activity. So, my thought is you have permanent leadership. I'm not sure it was hereditary, passed from a parent to a child in whatever form, but it certainly, they had clear lines of leadership, and they knew how they were going to choose their leaders, and that they were going to have leadership the whole way that Chaco was occupied.
Right.
So it wasn't a temporary thing. It was a permanent thing. And, if you visited Chaco as an outsider from a different tribal group, and asked to be presented to a leader, you would have been presented to someone who was, one of the leaders in Chaco. So, I use that example just to make it clear that it's not like you're going to end up with 50 people staring around at each other going, we're not sure. Now,
right.
Decision making is an interesting portion of this. In the Pueblos today, and we can talk about this a little more later, but the Pueblos today, all of them have councils that deliberate on different matters. And in general, and there are some exceptions, but in general, they have to reach decisions communally. So there needs to be unanimous agreement at the end of a process of debate about whether they're going to put in, this water system or whatever the project they might be doing, on their own Pueblo lands. So, and, certainly disagreements come up, but there are mechanisms in place to work through those. So one of the real interesting questions about, ancient societies like Chaco and what happened at Aztec and Salmon and across Mesa Verde and a big portion of the northern Southwest is, were these sites managed by essentially similar councils, where people would get together and discuss it? And did you ultimately have sort of an executive type leader who, today many of the Pueblos have a leader in place. That's a Spanish word. It's called cacique. And for many of them, that's their ultimate sort of supreme religious person in charge of that portion of their society. Well, when the Spanish came in, they introduced basically civil leadership to the Pueblos that was a complement, if you will, and it's sometimes an opposing force, and sometimes created some factions. But you had governors and then a whole staff of people who were tied to the governor position in the Pueblos, and they retain these to this day. about 6 of the Pueblos plus the Hopis elect those governors. The other about 2/3, almost 15, those are appointed by the council at the end of a calendar year. So there's this interesting mix, and diversity of leadership. But I think it's fair to say that there is a certain communalism to that. Now the councils are, at this point, I believe for the Pueblos, they're all men. So I don't believe there are women on the Pueblo councils at this point. And they're relatively small groups. So, we have 10 to 12, sometimes as many as 14 or 15. And they're making decisions for a Pueblo like at Zuni that might have 5,000 or 6,000 people. So it is a fairly small leadership group. And, some things do get put to all the members of a Pueblo through referenda, and similar things. But most of the leadership group is fairly small.
Interesting.
At this point. So, and again, it's hard to reconstruct that looking back at Chaco. And other people, again, sort of the Steve Lexon model, go to Chaco, see what's going on, and said, yeah, this had to be really well organized, and leaders who were probably hereditary leaders and who were maybe considered nobility by people in the thing.
Right.
The question of nobility in Pueblo society, like I said, is a tricky one, and we really don't see the signs that we have for nobility everywhere else in the world, which is generally personal wealth accrual. So you don't have super, super rich, deposits in particular places in many of the sites we studied that would say, okay, this is definitely the home of the leader. So that's one of the things that gives us some pause as we consider sort of the aspects of leadership in the past.
Right. Interesting. My guest this morning, archaeologist Paul Reed, is here. He works with Archaeology Southwest. He's done a lot of work at Chaco Canyon and Salmon Ruins, of course, here in San Juan County. And it sounds like, at least from me listening to you, Paul, that we see over time maybe the separation of church and state, that maybe originally some of these leaders were religious leaders as well as maybe political leaders, for lack of a better term, with some of these groups of people. And then over time, they decided to maybe the religious leader would be on one side, and then the political leaders or the other community leaders would take on other jobs and make other decisions for the larger group. Does that make any sense?
Right. It's definitely true. And one of the other things that I, when I'm thinking about these societies in the past, and particularly in the ancient Pueblo world, is, I try to remind people that, with our Western style of thinking, we like to divide things out, right? So we dichotomize, we trichotomize, we quadcotomize.
Right.
I don't know if that's a word, but we say this is over here. Here's the economics. Here's the social system. Here's the political system. Here's the religious system. One of the things that I think helps me have hopefully better insight on Chaco is to try not to divide things so much. But to think of it as more of a unified whole. And this is something that I have learned from some of my interactions with Pueblo friends and colleagues. And I'm certainly not trying to represent their viewpoints here, but I think for Pueblo people, present and past, the world's a more integrated place. So the notion even of having, quote, a secular leader versus a religious one, maybe doesn't make a whole lot of sense to them.
Right.
The system that the Spanish introduced, on the other hand, was a definite dichotomization of what may have been single integrated positions of leadership. So again, you end up with a supreme, with a cultural, religious leader, a cacique, a head priest in a different society, and then you have the Spanish imposed governor and all the staff there. In the past, though, I'm not sure those things existed. So this is a somewhat roundabout answer to get to this, but so people have thought that perhaps Chaco was governed through, a religious hierarchy of people who were at the heads of these religious societies and within different portions of, say, Pueblo Benito, and that the leadership then rested with people at the top of those hierarchies, people who decided when to plant, people who may have watched the skies for different, movements, telling them now's the time to plant, now's the time to harvest, people who looked for rain and were in charge of, that aspect of the ceremonialism, how to bring the rains, a huge concern for agricultural peoples worldwide. So I'm not sure we can even really try to slice this out and say, well, Chaco had this kind of political leadership, because, we think the ceremonialism and the religious aspect was so important that there probably wasn't those differences.
Sure.
At least those are the thoughts that I have.
Right. And you mentioned the other areas that we're familiar with, of course, Salmon ruins, Aztec ruins, even maybe Mesa Verde, that we certainly know were linked to Chaco and Chaco Canyon. But I guess what we maybe don't know, or what we're still looking into, is how much governance came from a central location, if Chaco was the overall end all to that society, or if they were given autonomy to deal with their own local issues. Or maybe we do know a little bit more than maybe I know. You probably know more than I do. I know that you do.
Well,
that's a fact.
Well, I appreciate the question, Scott, because that really goes to the heart of this, what we talk about as Chacoan society or the Pueblo society in the past at Chaco. So we have certainly Pueblo developments over a number of areas in the 800s, in the mid 800s, the 900s. A lot of things coalesced in Chaco in this time period by 900, 950. And then we begin to see across the landscape, first to the south, and then to the north and west and other areas, people building sites that look like Chacoan sites. And in some cases, as some research we did a few years ago, we're basically able to demonstrate through different lines of material culture that, people actually left Chaco to build first the site at Solomon at about 1090, and then began with the Aztec community at 1100 and working through the 1100s there. So those cases seem to be an example of people leaving this place at Chaco that was their home for a long time and saying, we're going to venture out here, and part of the discussion that's ensued on this is people say, well, it's only 50 or 60 miles from Chaco to these areas. This isn't really new territory. The interesting thing is we don't have a whole lot of Pueblo sites in the area surrounding either Solomon on the San Juan or Aztec on the Animas before we begin to see people coming out of Chaco and going up there. So if it was part of a larger Pueblo territory, I think, which we could probably say, it wasn't really, they weren't part of the Chacoan system until there was a commitment to build those sites.
Interesting.
Now, leadership at Solomon and Aztec, I think, was probably fairly closely tied, especially in the early years, to what was happening in Chaco Canyon. But what I also, the contrast I like to make for people, and, is this wasn't like a Roman system. So Rome was what we'd classify as a complicated state level society. Obviously, it was 2,000 years ago, it was pre-industrial. But the Romans, for anybody who studied this, were highly organized. They built roads everywhere. They put in different Roman villas and basically administrative centers over a huge portion of Europe into the Middle East, a little bit of Asia, all the way as far west as England. That's not what Chaco was. So, we can talk about similarities. The Chacoans also spread out over a large geographic territory, covering portions of the four modern states, an area about the size of country of Ireland or, the state of Indiana or Ohio, something like 30 million acres, a big area. But, this wasn't a state level society. There weren't the millions of people that we think were tied to Rome's spread. Chaco, as far as we know, didn't have large standing armies ready to, conquer and pull in adjacent territory. Those kinds of things happened well to the south. The Aztecs were an expansionary, empire that started in the early 15th century and then, dominated a huge portion of what we call Mexico today. Chaco wasn't that. So Chaco seems to be more of some spread from the center, but then local leaders saying, we're going to connect to Chaco. We're going to build one of these large buildings that signifies membership in this larger Chaco political religious system, if that's what it was, and then we're going to produce items that we can make in our area, whether that's pottery, whether that's wood and timber for building, whether it's, good napping stone to make projectile points and other tools, a whole range of things. Food, one of the things about the expansion into the San Juan Valley at Solomon, in the Animas Valley at Aztec is people were probably growing lots and lots of food that was then circulating through Chaco and other sites at that time. So it seems to be more a matter of, not an entirely voluntary organization, but people coming together to be part of this society, bound together by the Chacoan architecture, by the Chacoan ritual system, which again, we have just a real sort of initial understanding of, and that it wasn't a militaristic expansionary Empire. So
Interesting. Right.
and I think there was a great deal of local autonomy too. That's my feeling.
Okay. Interesting. It almost sounds communal in a way, Paul Reed. And
Right.
we just have a couple of minutes remaining this morning, and I guess maybe the other differences too between Roman history and even maybe Egyptian history is maybe the lack of writing anything down, and that's the one thing that we don't see right at Chaco. We have some maybe things that were like paintings and designs and things like that, but really no other either written type of language, at least that's been discovered thus far. Isn't that true?
Right, right. So we don't have, even like you have in Mesoamerica, the stelae that, list the rulers and different Mayan dynasties through time. And, it's unclear exactly why those kinds of record keeping systems didn't come up from the south to the north. We know, looking at the way things develop, that the notion of sedentism, living in a place permanently, growing different types of crops, that those things spread from greater Mesoamerica into first the area in Arizona that we call the Hohokam or Huhugam area, and then over into the Pueblo Southwest, but not this record keeping thing and this writing on the stone. Now we do have petroglyphs and pictographs that record different things that were obviously important to folks in the past, but not something that we can say this is an alphabet, or that, even along the lines of hieroglyphics or any of the Mayan things, the way people talk about that, at least, is that, we don't have the population density and really the need for those systems to be in place. If we look at areas to the south, we have hundreds of thousands and even millions of people that were part of these different empires. The Toltec Empire pretty much overlaps perfectly with Chaco, and that's around, modern Mexico City and north, the Mayans to the south and east at the same time period, and then, of course, later the Aztecs, well after people had left Chaco.
Right.
These are large expansionary groups who did use military means and other things to, control a very large population. It does look more communal, to circle back to your point, but again, with enough leadership in there that we're not just, hey, we're going to build Pueblo Benito, it's a barn raising, And certainly I think people were willing to contribute their labor to these different construction projects, and to go 50 miles away into the Chusca Mountains to the west to cut wood, to let the wood season, bring back seasoned wood, and the really cool thing about that is we have a tree ring record with dates from early in the 900s all the way through the 1100s, and wood was cut every single year. And
Wow.
It may not have been absolutely stockpiled centrally. There probably were stockpiles, resource piles, if you will, that were tied to this site and that site. But the interesting thing is it happened every single year, and that indicates a real organized, systematic system to cut the wood, age it, and bring it in for use in these projects. So,
and that's some long-term planning too, right? I mean, because we're talking over a year.
Long-term planning, and that's what we see in the sites is, here's where we're going to build it. This is what we envision for the total size, and we're going to build it relatively quickly,
Right.
Over 10 to 15 years. Pueblo Benito is an exception because that site starts in the mid-800s and has some construction activity well into the after 81,000 and even some minor repairs into the 1100s. Most of the big Chacoan sites are planned and built on a scale of just a few decades. At Solomon, the site that I know best, of course, we've got wood being cut from the mid-800s all the way up, the mid-1000s, 1080s, all the way up to about 1090. And then most of the site put up a 3-story Pueblo built completely by 1106 or 1107.
Amazing.
So,
Wow.
an intensive, no more than 20-year construction project. And, thousands of pieces of wood, millions of pieces of individual sandstone that were, chiseled, snapped to position, set into the walls. And so nothing to say, well, this is just a small task groups and the barn raising, but
Right.
not Rome either. So I hope that makes some sense to folks. And it's not all about classifying, indigenous sites according to some European scale either. We can appreciate things for what they are and try to understand them. And that's why I bring up the other New World examples to
Sure.
the south. But it does help to have a sense of scale and say, okay, for Greater Chaco, we're looking at tens of thousands of people. We're not talking hundreds of thousands or millions like we have in these other places worldwide. And so you can do things more communally with smaller group sizes.
Right.
You need the leadership, but it works a little differently.
True. But it still shows, I think, that there was someone in these positions or a group of people in these positions making these decisions that we're going to build this here and we're going to build it this size. We're going to contribute or plan this many of our resources and workers to do this over this many years or whatever the case may be. So obviously somebody had to be making those decisions at some point.
And you have to have durable leadership that goes from generation to generation to make that happen. So that's why the barn raising model doesn't work. And this person's going to be a temporary crew boss over here, and then we'll hand off. Now, rotating leadership is certainly possible, but you have to have that core of planners and builders and architects to, these buildings are still standing. I tell people, and, they were built as monuments. And that's one of the reasons they built them in stone so massively and so tall, is they had a vision of the site still being on the landscape in 1,000 years, in my view.
Right.
And they did a great job because they're still here. And we're fortunate that, people intervened early enough in Chaco's history and the history of other places to keep the pot hunters and the looters away, the people who would knock down the walls and steal all the amazing items, and that enough of those of our sites were preserved, for everyone to enjoy today.
Very true. Well, and we're grateful for folks like you who help us understand what we're looking at these wonderful sites. So, Paul, thank you so much. We're out of time, is what happens to us, but it's been a fascinating conversation today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Scott. And talking about Chaco, it's a little bit of an arm twist, but
I know. That's okay. We appreciate it, and the insights are great and fascinating. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We'll talk to you again next month. That is archaeologist Paul Reed from Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins, my guest here on KSJE. And I'll be back with more in just a moment, everybody. Of course, the time right now is 8:45.
I'm Tracy K. Smith, and this is The Slowdown. Motherland, Madre Patria. We are born of a nation, and we are shaped by its features. Whatever that nation offers, whether it's hardship or opportunity, is our inheritance. When we see ourselves belonging wholly to our nation, it can be difficult to decipher its flaws and shortcomings. We make excuses for its failures and contradictions, just as family members sometimes cover for one another. It's a form of denial. Conversely,